May 8, 1945. London. The war in Europe had effectively ended, but the decision was made before the celebrations began. Inside a quiet office in Whitehall, Winston Churchill met with Britain's senior military leadership. The atmosphere was formal, restrained, and tense. No reporters were present. No minutes were intended for circulation. What was issued in that room was not a discussion, not a contingency, and not a speculative exercise. It was a directive. Churchill ordered the Joint Planning Staff to prepare a full-scale military offensive against the Soviet Union. The instruction was explicit. The objective was to force the Red Army out of Eastern Europe and compel Joseph Stalin to comply with agreements concerning Poland and the post-war settlement. This was not framed as a defensive response to provocation. It was an initiative attack intended to begin on July 1, 1945, less than 8 weeks away. The code name assigned to the directive was Operation Unthinkable. Those present understood immediately what the order implied. The Soviet Union was still formally an ally. Soviet forces were still fighting German units in the east. Berlin had not yet fully fallen. Yet Churchill demanded feasibility studies, force assessments, operational concepts, and timelines. He instructed his chiefs to assume American participation and to consider all available means to achieve parity with Soviet strength. Among those means was a proposal that unsettled the room. Churchill directed planners to assess the possibility of rearming German soldiers who had just surrendered to British and American forces. Former enemies, disarmed days earlier, were to be evaluated as potential combat units against the Red Army. Numbers, reliability, command structure, and political risk were to be calculated, not debated. The chiefs did not argue. They recorded the order and began their work. They were acutely aware of the imbalance. The Red Army in Europe numbered in the millions, organized into scores of divisions, with decisive superiority in armor and artillery. British and American forces were exhausted, preparing for demobilization and already earmarking units for redeployment to the Pacific. None of this altered the directive. Churchill did not ask whether the plan was likely to succeed. He asked how it could be executed. Outside, crowds gathered. Flags were raised. Cameras captured a victory sign held aloft from a balcony overlooking Whitehall. The public marked the end of one war. Inside the system of command, another was being quietly prepared. The opportunity existed only because of timing, geography, and exhaustion, not because of balance. In late May 1945, the Red Army occupied the ground that mattered. Its forces stretched from the Baltic to the Balkans, anchored on Berlin and fanned across Eastern Europe. Yet that dominance concealed a temporary vulnerability. The Soviet advance had reached the limits of its logistical elasticity. Units were forward, but supply lines were long, rail networks damaged, and stockpiles unevenly distributed after months of continuous combat. From a purely military perspective, this was the narrow opening Churchill wanted examined. Western Allied forces still held intact industrial regions, deep ports, and uninterrupted Atlantic supply routes. Air superiority remained decisively in Anglo-American hands. The Luftwaffe was finished. Soviet air forces, while numerous, were short on fuel and operational reach west of the Oder. In any initial phase of conflict, the Western Allies could have dominated the airspace, disrupted Soviet movement, and slowed reinforcement cycles. The planners identified the northern German plain as the only plausible axis of advance. The terrain favored mobility. Rivers ran east to west, not north to south, offering defensive barriers against counterattack while allowing Allied forces to maneuver laterally. A concentrated offensive launched from northern Germany could, in theory, strike Soviet formations before they fully reorganized from the final battles against Germany. Speed was the critical variable. Any offensive would have required immediate commitment of American armored formations, British ground forces, and maximum air support. Delay would erase the advantage. Every week allowed Soviet engineers to repair rail lines, consolidate depots, and rotate exhausted divisions out of the front. The opportunity window was measured in weeks, not months. The planners also considered force disposition. Soviet units were numerous, but many were positioned for occupation and security, not maneuver warfare. Garrison duties in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans diluted combat concentration. A rapid strike aimed at the junctions between Soviet fronts could potentially disrupt coordination and force a defensive realignment. This was the logic Churchill wanted quantified. Yet numbers intruded immediately. Soviet ground forces in Europe outnumbered Western Allied troops by a wide margin. In armor and artillery, the disparity was even greater. The Red Army could absorb losses that British forces could not politically sustain. American units, though better supplied, were already under orders to prepare for redeployment to the Pacific. The manpower pool available for a European war was shrinking by the day. That reality produced the most controversial element of the opportunity assessment: rearmed German forces. From an operational standpoint, German units offered two things the Western Allies lacked: familiarity with Eastern European terrain and immediate manpower. The planners identified approximately 100,000 surrendered German troops in Western custody who could, in theory, be reorganized into auxiliary formations. These units would not lead an offensive, but they could secure rear areas, reinforce defensive lines, and free Allied divisions for frontline operations. The concept was militarily coherent and politically explosive. Reliability was uncertain. Command integration would be fragile. Morale could not be assumed. But in cold numerical terms, these formations represented the only mechanism by which the Western Allies could approach something resembling parity during the opening phase of operations. The opportunity, therefore, was conditional. It depended on surprise, speed, and the assumption that Soviet leadership would hesitate before committing its full weight against former allies. If the Red Army paused, even briefly, to assess intentions, negotiate, or reposition, the Western Allies might stabilize a new front line deep enough to impose political leverage. If the Soviets reacted immediately and decisively, the window would close at once. The planners understood this. Their assessments made no claims of decisive victory. They described scenarios of initial penetration followed by increasingly violent counteroffensives. Even in the most optimistic projections, success meant forcing negotiation, not achieving military defeat. The opportunity was real only in the narrowest technical sense. It existed because armies were still deployed, because alliances had not yet hardened into permanent hostility, and because exhaustion had not yet been replaced by consolidation. It was the last moment when movement was still possible before Europe froze into occupation zones. That was what Churchill demanded to know. Not whether the plan was wise. Not whether it was survivable. Only whether the door was still open. The answer, delivered without embellishment, was that it was. Barely. By early May 1945, Churchill's understanding of the strategic picture was already fully formed. He did not arrive at Operation Unthinkable impulsively, nor did he misunderstand the military balance. His warning was not emotional. It was analytical, grounded in a reading of power rather than goodwill. Churchill believed the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was a temporary convergence of necessity, not a durable settlement. In his assessment, the moment Germany collapsed, the structural incentives binding the alliance dissolved. What remained was an imbalance of force on the European continent, tilted decisively toward Moscow. The Red Army was not positioned defensively. It was deployed for control. He judged Soviet intentions not by declared commitments, but by physical occupation. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were already under Soviet military authority. Provisional governments were being shaped under Red Army supervision. Communications, security services, and transport nodes were controlled by Soviet officers. Churchill interpreted this not as post-war stabilization, but as irreversible consolidation unless checked immediately. This assessment was delivered to his military chiefs without rhetorical framing. He did not argue ideology. He argued momentum. Once the Soviets completed their redeployment, demobilized auxiliary units, and converted wartime formations into occupation garrisons, the cost of dislodging them would rise exponentially. Churchill believed that July 1945 marked the last moment when Soviet forces were still exposed, fatigued, and logistically stretched. Delay meant permanence. His warning extended beyond troop counts. Churchill anticipated that American political attention would pivot rapidly toward the Pacific. The defeat of Germany removed the primary justification for sustaining large U.S. ground forces in Europe. He foresaw demobilization pressure, domestic exhaustion, and congressional resistance to any new European commitment. If Britain waited for consensus, it would lose leverage entirely. This was the context in which he demanded planning, not permission. Churchill instructed his chiefs to treat the question as operational, not diplomatic. He required projections that assumed Soviet resistance at full strength. He wanted casualty estimates without mitigation. He wanted worst-case outcomes, not optimistic scenarios. The purpose of the exercise was not to sell the plan, but to expose its consequences before political realities made choice impossible. The planners responded with professional rigor, but Churchill was not reassured by their caution. He already expected catastrophic projections. What concerned him was not defeat, but passivity. He believed that refusing to prepare guaranteed a different form of failure, political irrelevance enforced by military fact. His warning also reflected an institutional lesson drawn from the interwar period. Churchill had lived through the consequences of delayed rearmament, misplaced trust, and treaty-based assumptions unsupported by force. In his mind, Eastern Europe in 1945 resembled Central Europe in 1936, a region where political outcomes were being decided by the presence or absence of troops, not by conference declarations. He believed that once the Soviets controlled the ground, no later negotiation could reverse it. He did not conceal this assessment from his staff. He warned that Soviet compliance with agreements would be temporary at best, that free elections promised under Allied declarations would be administered by security services loyal to Moscow, that withdrawal timelines would be extended indefinitely, that Western protest would be met with fait accompli, not compromise. Churchill's preparation was therefore defensive in conception, even if offensive in execution. He sought to create a credible threat, not necessarily to unleash it. In his view, planning itself was leverage. Without the ability to act, Britain would have no voice in shaping the post-war order. With it, even if unused, there remained the possibility of constraint. This distinction mattered to him. He did not order mobilization. He ordered analysis. He did not demand public alignment. He demanded readiness. The warning he issued was not to the Soviets, but to his own system. If the Western Allies allowed the Red Army's wartime disposition to harden into peacetime borders, those borders would define Europe for generations. Churchill's warning was clear, internally consistent, and unemotional. It assumed that power seeks consolidation, that alliances dissolve when incentives shift, and that delay is itself a decision. Whether the response would match the clarity of the assessment was not yet decided, but the warning had been delivered. The plan did not fail on a battlefield. It failed where most wars are decided before they begin, inside institutions built to prevent exactly this kind of rupture. By mid-May 1945, the British military leadership had completed its initial assessments. Their conclusions were stark and internally consistent. Any offensive against the Soviet Union would face overwhelming numerical inferiority. Even with air superiority, even with rapid concentration, even with German auxiliaries, the balance of force favored Moscow decisively. These findings were delivered to the Prime Minister without softening language. They did not stop him. What stopped the plan was not the data, but the system that surrounded it. Churchill's authority, though immense, was no longer absolute. Britain was days away from a general election. The country was exhausted. Rationing continued. Demobilization was expected, not another war. The political legitimacy required to initiate a new conflict, especially against a former ally, did not exist. No cabinet consensus could be formed around the idea, and Churchill did not attempt to form one. Public opinion was not merely unprepared. It was structurally opposed. The narrative of victory depended on unity. The image of Britain standing alongside the United States and the Soviet Union was central to post-war legitimacy. Any suggestion that this unity was false would undermine the very victory being celebrated. A preemptive confrontation with the Red Army would have reframed the war as unfinished, unresolved, and morally ambiguous. The political cost was incalculable. Across the Atlantic, the constraints were even tighter. The United States had undergone a sudden transition of leadership. Franklin Roosevelt was dead. Harry Truman was inexperienced, cautious, and acutely aware of domestic pressure to end the war, not expand it. American military planners were already focused on Japan. The invasion of the home islands loomed. Every available division, every transport ship, every logistical calculation was being redirected eastward. Churchill could not compel American participation. Without American forces, Operation Unthinkable was not merely risky. It was impossible. Britain alone could not sustain a continental war against the Soviet Union, and Truman had no incentive to authorize one. The American public had not been prepared for such a pivot. Congress had not been consulted. The political capital required did not exist. Alliance management imposed its own veto. The Anglo-American command structure depended on trust, restraint, and predictability. A unilateral British initiative against the Soviets would fracture that structure instantly. It would force Washington to choose between supporting an unwanted war or publicly restraining its closest ally. Either outcome would damage American leadership at the precise moment it was consolidating global authority. Churchill understood this. This is why Operation Unthinkable never moved beyond planning. The Prime Minister pressed for analysis, but did not issue mobilization orders. He demanded feasibility studies, but avoided cabinet endorsement. He kept the project compartmentalized, insulated from political exposure, and ultimately deniable. The proposal to rearm German troops crystallized the institutional resistance. From a military perspective, it was rational. From a political perspective, it was radioactive. The idea of arming former Wehrmacht soldiers weeks after victory over Nazi Germany threatened to collapse the moral architecture of the war itself. It would have alienated France, destabilized occupied Germany, and provoked outrage across Europe. No civilian government could survive its public revelation. Even within the military, the idea was treated as a theoretical last resort, not an executable option. The British Chiefs of Staff did not refuse Churchill's directive. They did something more decisive. They complied fully, documented meticulously, and embedded their objections in the language of professional analysis. Risk assessments multiplied. Casualty projections expanded. Scenarios grew increasingly pessimistic. The plan became a record of impossibility rather than a roadmap to action. Institutional caution did not confront Churchill directly. It outlasted him. The decisive moment came not with a formal cancellation, but with a change of government. In July 1945, Churchill lost the general election. His authority evaporated overnight. Operation Unthinkable, already constrained by alliance politics and public legitimacy, lost its only sponsor. The machinery of the state did not reverse course. It simply stopped moving. Files were sealed. Documents were classified. The planning staff shifted to defensive studies. The concept of confrontation with the Soviet Union was reframed, gradually and quietly, into containment rather than collision. What overruled the plan was not cowardice or ignorance. It was the convergence of electoral reality, alliance dependency, institutional inertia, and the recognition that military logic cannot operate independently of political permission. Churchill had demanded readiness. The system delivered restraint. Operation Unthinkable was not rejected in debate. It was smothered by process. By the time the Red Army consolidated its positions, the decision had already been made without announcement. The moment had passed. The consequences began immediately, even without a single shot being fired. Once Operation Unthinkable stalled inside the planning apparatus, the strategic environment shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. The absence of a Western challenge was not neutral. It was permissive. Every day, without confrontation, allowed the Red Army to convert wartime momentum into post-war control. Soviet forces did not pause after Germany's collapse. They reorganized. Frontline formations were reclassified as occupation armies. Logistics networks were repaired and hardened. Rail lines from the east were restored with urgency. Fuel depots, ammunition stores, and command headquarters were established deep inside newly occupied territories. What had been an extended advance became a fortified presence. The Western Allies, by contrast, began to disengage. American units were withdrawn or reassigned. Troops expected demobilization. Equipment was earmarked for shipment to the Pacific or return to depots. Political directives emphasized stability, not movement. The opportunity Churchill had identified did not close suddenly. It narrowed day by day until it disappeared entirely. Nowhere was this asymmetry more visible than in Eastern Europe. Poland, whose sovereignty had been the stated casus belli of the war in 1939, was transformed under Soviet supervision. Provisional governments were installed, opposition figures marginalized or arrested, and security services placed under Moscow's direction. Elections promised at Allied conferences were delayed, manipulated, or rendered meaningless. The presence of the Red Army ensured compliance without negotiation. Similar patterns emerged across the region. In Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, Soviet commanders dictated internal security arrangements. Communist parties, often marginal before the war, were elevated through control of police forces and ministries of interior. Western diplomatic protests were registered and ignored. There was no military counterweight to support them. The consequences of inaction extended beyond Eastern Europe. The Western Allies' decision to halt at agreed demarcation lines reinforced the legitimacy of Soviet occupation zones. The most visible example had already occurred weeks earlier, when American and British forces stopped at the Elbe. German resistance beyond that point was minimal. The road to Berlin had been open. Yet political agreements, not battlefield conditions, determined the limit of advance. That halt became precedent. By choosing not to contest Soviet movement, the Western Allies implicitly accepted a continental division enforced by force rather than consent. The absence of Operation Unthinkable removed the last theoretical obstacle to that division becoming permanent. The military consequences were equally stark. Soviet planners, who had anticipated eventual friction with the West, were relieved of immediate pressure. They no longer needed to maintain offensive readiness against Anglo-American forces. Units could be rotated, retrained, and politically indoctrinated. Command structures shifted from combat operations to internal security and border defense. The Red Army's wartime experience was institutionalized, not exhausted. Western military planners drew their own conclusions. The internal assessments prepared for Operation Unthinkable were not discarded. They were archived. They became reference material. Their conclusions, that a direct ground war in Europe against the Soviet Union was unwinnable under post-war conditions, shaped strategic thinking for years. The lesson absorbed was not how to fight such a war, but how to avoid being forced into one. This recalibration affected operational behavior almost immediately. Aggressive maneuvers near Soviet zones were curtailed. Patrol boundaries hardened. Liaison protocols multiplied. Every encounter was managed to avoid escalation. Military caution became doctrine, not by written order, but by accumulated constraint. The most profound consequence, however, was psychological. Operation Unthinkable had been conceived as leverage. Its failure to materialize signaled to all parties that the Western Allies would not challenge Soviet occupation militarily. This understanding did not require public declaration. It was inferred through behavior. Soviet actions grew more assertive. Western responses grew more procedural. Power flowed to where force already stood. By late 1945, the strategic picture was settled. Europe was divided into zones of influence that mirrored the final positions of armies in May. The Iron Curtain, later named, was already in place as a military fact before it became a rhetorical one. The absence of Western resistance had transformed temporary deployment into permanent alignment. Even the hypothetical costs outlined by the planners became part of the consequence. The projections of catastrophic casualties, of Soviet counteroffensives driving westward, of cities reduced again to battlefields, reinforced political restraint. Leaders who reviewed these assessments internalized a simple conclusion. Whatever the injustices of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, the price of overturning it militarily was unacceptable. This belief hardened quickly. As months passed, Soviet control deepened and Western resolve adapted. What had once been framed as a violation of wartime agreements was reframed as an unfortunate but immutable reality. Diplomatic language softened. Expectations adjusted. The possibility of reversal faded. The decision not to act also shaped alliance dynamics. Britain's influence declined sharply after Churchill's removal. Without his urgency, London deferred increasingly to Washington. The United States, prioritizing global stability and reconstruction, pursued strategies designed to manage Soviet power rather than confront it directly. Europe became a theater of containment, not liberation. Operation Unthinkable, though unexecuted, thus achieved an unintended outcome. It clarified the limits of Western action. By proving, on paper, that military options were politically and operationally unviable, it narrowed the range of future choices. When later crises emerged, Berlin, Prague, Budapest, the memory of 1945 loomed silently in the background. The line not crossed once became the line not crossed again. The battlefield never bore witness to Operation Unthinkable. Its consequences were registered instead in borders drawn, governments installed, armies stationed, and assumptions hardened. The war ended without a final reckoning between former allies. The settlement that followed reflected not justice or agreement, but the residue of unchallenged force. The absence of action was itself an action, and it shaped the world that followed. For more than 5 decades, Operation Unthinkable existed only as a rumor denied by those who knew better. Its survival was not accidental. It was buried deliberately, preserved not as a policy option, but as a record of how close the system came to confronting its own limits. When the documents were finally declassified in 1998, they confirmed what had long been suspected. The plan had been real. The dates had been fixed. The objectives had been explicit. And the conclusions reached by the Joint Planning Staff were unequivocal. A war against the Soviet Union in 1945 would almost certainly have been lost. The post-war record leaves no ambiguity on this point. The planners' assessments showed that even with American participation, even with air superiority, and even with the extraordinary measure of rearming German troops, the Western Allies lacked the manpower depth to sustain prolonged combat on the continent. Soviet reserves were vast. Soviet tolerance for casualties was higher. Soviet control of Eastern Europe provided strategic depth that could not be neutralized quickly. Later archival analysis reinforced these conclusions rather than softening them. Soviet military records, released after the collapse of the USSR, showed that the Red Army had already begun contingency planning for conflict with the West by mid-1945. Defensive belts were being surveyed. Occupation forces were being reorganized with internal security in mind. The assumption in Moscow was not partnership, but friction. Had a Western offensive occurred, it would not have found an unprepared adversary. Memoirs from British and American officers involved in the planning process are strikingly consistent. None claimed that the plan was viable. None described internal debate over whether it should be executed. The tone was uniformly procedural. They were given an order. They executed it intellectually. They delivered the result. One senior planner later described the exercise as a demonstration of impossibility, not an operational rehearsal. That characterization aligns closely with the documents themselves. The further the analysis progressed, the less executable the plan became. Every added layer of realism reduced its plausibility. The post-war record also clarifies Churchill's role. Contrary to later portrayals that framed Operation Unthinkable as impulsive or reckless, the documents show a leader fully aware of the risks. Churchill did not dispute the casualty projections. He did not challenge the assessments of Soviet strength. He did not demand revisions to improve optimism. He accepted the conclusions. What he did not accept was the idea that Britain could afford not to look. In that sense, Operation Unthinkable functioned exactly as he intended. It forced the system to confront the military reality behind diplomatic language. It stripped away assumptions. It revealed that once armies were in place, politics followed force, not the other way around. The record also confirms that the plan had no institutional afterlife as an offensive concept. There is no evidence that later British or NATO war planning ever seriously contemplated a similar preemptive strike in Europe. Instead, the logic of Operation Unthinkable inverted itself. The recognition that a conventional ground war against the Soviet Union was unwinnable led directly to strategies designed to prevent one from starting. Containment replaced confrontation. Forward defense replaced rollback. Nuclear deterrence replaced massed armies. These shifts were not announced as lessons learned from Operation Unthinkable, but the continuity is visible. The planning assumptions of the early Cold War reflect an acceptance of the same constraints identified in 1945. Europe would not be liberated by force without unacceptable cost. Stability would be managed, not imposed. Churchill himself never publicly acknowledged the plan. In later speeches, he warned of an iron curtain descending across Europe, but he did not reveal how close he had come to attempting to stop it militarily. The absence of that disclosure was itself a form of judgment. By the time he spoke openly, the moment for action had already passed. The post-war record closes the case with clarity. Operation Unthinkable was not abandoned because it was immoral, provocative, or premature. It was abandoned because it exposed a reality no democratic system could absorb. That victory in one war had created conditions that made another both inevitable in logic and impossible in execution. The plan remains significant not because it might have changed history if enacted, but because it shows how history was constrained before choices were visible. It records the point at which power, politics, and exhaustion converged, and it marks the moment when the post-war world became fixed. The case closes without ambiguity. Operation Unthinkable was not a fantasy, a bluff, or a misinterpreted memo. It was a direct order issued at the highest level of the British government, demanding preparation for war against the Soviet Union at the moment of Allied victory. It was conceived deliberately, analyzed professionally, and abandoned quietly. The decision at its center was not whether to attack. It was whether to retain the ability to do so. Churchill understood that military power, once surrendered, cannot be recovered through negotiation. He also understood that Britain lacked the authority to act alone. What he misjudged was not Soviet strength, but the political capacity of democratic systems to sustain readiness without public consent. The planners delivered the truth the system required. The numbers did not work. The casualties would be catastrophic. The alliance would fracture. The electorate would revolt. The war would not be won. That conclusion did not prevent the outcome Churchill feared. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control without resistance. Occupation became permanence. Agreements became formalities. The line drawn by advancing armies became the border that defined a continent for generations. Operation Unthinkable did not fail because it was never launched. It failed because the conditions that made it conceivable also made it impossible. Victory had exhausted legitimacy. Unity had become dependency. Power had shifted faster than political authority could follow. The war ended, but the settlement was decided elsewhere. The documents confirm what hindsight makes unavoidable. The last moment when the post-war order could have been contested passed not in conference halls, but in silence. The decision not to act became the most consequential act of all. This was not a moral judgment. It was a structural one. History closed the file without appeal. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped the 20th century after the shooting stopped, subscribe to the channel. If you believe this verdict deserves challenge or reinforcement, leave a comment. The record itself will not change.